A pro hero's arm shatters against a chest that doesn't move, not staggers, doesn't move. Somewhere above the ruins of a war zone, the Paranormal Liberation Front and Japan's strongest heroes are already burning through everything they have, and none of it has touched him yet. He didn't come through a portal built by science. He came through a tear in reality itself. A being whose rage has ended timelines in his own universe, and he just landed in the middle of a war that thought it understood what strongest meant. All Might's successor, all for one's army, the full weight of Japan's hero system, about to find out none of it was built for this. I'm Multiverse Saiyan, and this is What If Broly landed in My Hero Academia. Writer Charles Dixon brought this collision to life, and if you've got a what if that keeps you up at night, drop it in the comments, because we read every single one. Subscribe, hit that bell, and buckle in, because this fight is about to rewrite what strongest hero even means. There are moments the world remembers before it understands why, and this was one of them. A hairline fracture opening in the sky above the Gunga Mountain Villa's eastern ridge, silent at first, then screaming. A wound in the air itself that no quirk in this reality had a name for. The Paranormal Liberation War had already turned the valley into something unrecognizable. Smoke stood in columns where hero agencies had once mapped clean evacuation routes. The eastern flank, 3 kilometers off from where the war's true weight was breaking against Shigaraki and the heroes converging on him, had become its own smaller battlefield. A satellite skirmish where Public Safety Commission tactical units and a scattering of licensed pros fought to keep a Paranormal Liberation Front breakaway cell from flanking the main engagement. It was here, in this lesser fire, in this fight that history would have filed as a footnote, that reality tore. Kaito Fuyutsuki felt it before he saw it. The temperature dropped, not from his own quirk, which he'd been burning through for the better part of an hour building ice ramparts between his unit and Ashgrave's ash constructs, but from something else, something that reached past heat and cold into a register his body had no name for. He looked up. The sky was splitting, not clouds parting, not smoke thinning, the air itself peeling back like something torn along a seam that had never been meant to open, edges glowing an ugly green gold, humming with a pressure that made his back teeth ache. Every hero on that ridge stopped fighting. Even Ashgrave, mid-motion, his palm an inch from turning a support beam to ash, froze and tilted his head up with the rest of them. Something fell through. It did not fall like a person falls. It fell like a verdict, fast, heavy, absolute, trailing a wake of displaced air that cracked outward in a visible ring, and flattened the tree line for 30 meters in every direction before it even touched ground. The impact, when it came, did not sound like an explosion. It sounded like the mountain itself exhaling, one great compressed breath, and then the world went white with dust. When the dust settled, and it took a long time to settle, hanging suspended in air pressed strange and still, there was a crater where there had not been one, 40 meters wide, its edges smoking, and at the bottom of it stood a figure that made every trained instinct in Kaito's body scream wrong. He was enormous, not villain enormous, not the grotesque muscle mass of a body-warping quirk gone unchecked. This was something else, something proportioned and deliberate, like a statue carved by someone who understood exactly how much force a body could be built to hold. Dark hair, wild and long. A tattered blue gi, torn at the shoulder from the passage through, cinched by a red sash gone dull with dust. He knelt at the base of the crater on one knee, one fist pressed to the shattered stone, and for 3 full seconds nobody on that ridge moved, because nobody on that ridge had ever seen a human-shaped thing survive a fall that should have erased a city block and simply stand back up. He stood, he looked around him, not with confusion exactly, though there was something searching in it, some old and practiced wariness scanning terrain for threat, the way a man does who has woken up in strange places before and learned not to trust the quiet. His eyes swept the burning tree line, the ruined ridge, the two clusters of armed and costumed figures glaring at each other across a battlefield that made no sense to him, and something in his shoulders settled the way a held breath settles when it finally understands the shape of the danger it's in. Nobody spoke first. Ashgrave broke the silence by doing what villains in a war zone do. He moved to exploit the disruption. His hand shot toward the newcomer, ash already spreading from his fingertips in a gray wave, meant to blanket and calcify anything it touched. A reflex honed through 100 fights, where hesitation cost lives. The wave never reached him. He caught it, not dodged, not blocked with a technique, simply caught the leading edge of the ash cloud in one open palm the way a man catches a thrown ball, and it stopped there, clinging harmlessly to skin that did not calcify, did not gray, did not do anything at all except sit inert against a body that the quirk apparently had no purchase on. He looked down at his own hand, mildly, almost curious, then looked back up at Ashgrave with an expression that had shifted from wariness into something colder. That, Kaito heard himself say to the hero beside him, voice gone thin, should not have worked like that. Ashgrave, to his credit, didn't freeze twice. He unleashed a full barrage, ash spears hardening midair into stone-tipped projectiles, a dozen of them, aimed with the precision of a man who had killed pro heroes with exactly this technique before. Every one of them struck home. Every one of them shattered on impact against a chest that did not so much as rock backward, fragments of ashen stone raining harmlessly off him like hail off a mountainside. The stranger exhaled through his nose, unimpressed, and the air around him began to hum. It started as a pressure, the kind you feel in your ears before a storm, and built, in the space of a few heartbeats, into something visible, a golden light kindling at his feet, climbing his legs, wrapping his torso, until his dark hair began to lift and lighten strand by strand, gold bleeding through black from root to tip, his eyebrows fading, his eyes flooding with a teal-green glow that had no pupil left to soften it. The temperature on the ridge spiked, real heat this time, radiant and physical, and every icicle Kaito had spent the last hour constructing began, quietly, to weep and collapse. "Everyone back," Kaito shouted, and for once nobody in the tactical unit questioned the order. They fell back behind the tree line as Ashgrave, alone now on the open ground, stared up at a being who had gone from merely impossible to something closer to elemental, a golden-haired mountain of restrained force radiating heat like a struck match dropped into a fuel depot. Ashgrave did not run. Kaito would remember that later, in the reports, in the sleepless nights that followed, that the villain lieutenant had stood his ground and thrown one more ash wave, larger than the rest, a desperate wall of gray meant to bury the threat entirely. It reached him. It broke apart before it reached him, disintegrated by heat alone, ash catching fire and curling to nothing in the air 3 feet from his skin. He didn't retaliate immediately. That was the detail that stuck in every account gathered afterward, that the golden stranger simply watched the ash burn away, watched Ashgrave standing alone and out of options, and something in his expression was not fury but a kind of grim, ancient patience, the look of a man deciding whether a fight was even worth finishing. Ashgrave decided for him. He lunged, hand outstretched for a killing touch, ash roiling off his palm in a final surge, and the stranger caught his wrist between 2 fingers and stopped him dead, the way a man stops a child's tantrum. For one suspended second, the villain hung there, straining against a grip he could not break, his quirk pulsing uselessly against skin it could not calcify, and the golden figure looked at him, not with hatred, not even really with anger, but with the flat, weighing look of something ancient deciding whether this small, furious thing in front of it mattered at all. "You're not the ones who hurt me," he said. His voice was low, rough, carrying an accent that belonged to no country on this earth, each word chosen with the deliberate care of someone unused to speaking much. "So I won't finish you." He released the wrist. Ashgrave staggered back, cradling his own arm, and for the first time in the encounter, genuine fear crossed his face. Not fear of pain, Kaito would realize later, watching the footage, but fear of something that had just proven it could end him, and chosen, almost bored, not to. The Public Safety Commission tactical channel exploded with chatter within 90 seconds. Unregistered anomaly, unknown quirk signature, possible quirk negation, possible mass-scale energy manipulation, height approximately 220 centimeters, current status, hostile engagement with PLF forces, target unconfirmed friend or foe. Requesting immediate escalation, Kaito relayed it himself, hands not quite steady, watching the golden-haired giant turn slowly to survey the burning ridge, the retreating villain, the heroes still hidden in the tree line, watching him take a single, testing step forward into ruined earth that cracked further beneath even that light a footfall. He did not attack the tree line. That was the detail Kaito clung to as he radioed it in, the detail that would shape every decision the commission made in the hours that followed. The stranger simply stood in the crater he'd made, powering down by slow degrees, hair dimming from gold back toward black, the terrible heat receding, and looked up once more at the scar in the sky above him. The rift, already knitting shut, its green-gold light guttering out like a snuffed candle. He watched it close. Something crossed his face in that moment that had nothing to do with battle at all. Something closer to loss, brief and total, gone as quickly as it came, replaced by the same flat wariness he'd worn stepping out of the crater. Then he was alone. Truly alone, in a way the ridge's remaining heroes couldn't fully appreciate yet. Cut off from a universe, from two people who would by now be searching a scorched training ground light years and dimensions away, calling a name into air that would not answer. He didn't know that yet, not with certainty, but something in the set of his shoulders as he lowered himself back down into a crouch, forearms braced on his knees, suggested he suspected it already, and was choosing, for now, not to let it show. By the time the first commission response team arrived, 3 additional pro-heroes and a containment specialist, moving with the practiced caution of people who had spent a career walking toward things other people ran from, the golden light was gone entirely, and what remained sitting at the bottom of the crater was simply a very large man in a torn blue gi, black-haired again, watching them approach with eyes that had gone quiet but not soft. "Identify yourself," the containment specialist called out, quirk already primed, voice pitched to carry command without inviting confrontation. It was the kind of line drilled into every commission operative for exactly this scenario. First contact with an unregistered, unclassified anomaly. Contain the language, contain the frame. Do not let the anomaly set the terms of the encounter. He looked at her for a long moment, weighing, Kaito thought, watching from the tree line, always weighing. "Broly," he said finally, and nothing more. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't cooperation either. It was the sound of a being who had learned, across however many worlds and however much pain, that names were sometimes the only thing worth giving people who hadn't yet earned anything else, and that everything after the name would be decided by what they did next, not by what they promised. The containment specialist held her ground, though Kaito could see the tension in her posture, the careful math running behind her eyes. Behind her, more heroes were arriving by the minute, agency vehicles cutting engines at the ridge's edge, comm chatter thickening with names that carried real weight in this war, names attached to agencies that reported, eventually, all the way up to the Commission's war room and, not long after that, to the desk of the #1 hero himself. Nobody moved to attack him. Nobody moved to embrace him as an ally either. He simply sat at the bottom of a crater that hadn't existed an hour ago, in a world that had no framework for him, watched by a widening circle of people trying to decide what he was, and for the moment, that uneasy, watchful stillness was the only truce anyone had. Above them, far to the west, The true weight of the Paranormal Liberation War kept grinding on, oblivious, for now, to the fact that something had just fallen out of the sky, that no strategy session, no quirk database, no accumulated century of hero society's hard-won wisdom about power had ever accounted for. It would not stay oblivious for long. News of an anomaly travels differently through hero society than news of a villain does. A villain sighting moves through fixed channels, agency to agency, precinct to precinct, filtered through years of protocol built for exactly that shape of threat. An anomaly moves like water, finding every crack at once, because nobody has built the channel for it yet. And so within the hour, Broly's name, offered, not extracted, a detail the Commission's analysts would flag and reflag in their reports, had reached rooms far above the ridge where he still sat. It reached the war room first, the mobile command center coordinating the Paranormal Liberation War's main theater, where officers already stretched thin by Shigaraki's advance now had to carve attention toward a secondary crisis nobody had modeled for. It reached, soon after, Endeavor himself, pulled from the edge of his own engagement by a transmission marked urgent enough to override standing orders, because whatever else the #1 hero was in the middle of, an unclassified being capable of no-selling a PLF lieutenant's quirk and surviving an impact crater without visible injury was, by any reasonable calculation, the single most important variable on the battlefield. He arrived at the eastern ridge 40 minutes later, trailing heat like a held threat, and found a standoff that had barely moved. Broly still sat at the crater's base. The Commission's containment specialist and her small team still held a loose perimeter 30 meters out, weapons and quirks primed but not raised, because raising them had produced no useful outcome in the intervening 40 minutes, except confirming, twice more, that whatever this being was, provoking it accomplished nothing except making the air around him hum, with that unnerving golden pressure again. Endeavor took the scene in with the fast, total assessment that had made him #1. Crater depth, scorch pattern, the way the surrounding heroes held themselves, the specific quality of stillness in the seated figure at the center of it all. A stillness that read less like calm and more like a coiled spring being deliberately, effortfully held down. "Report," he said, and Kaito, still nearby, gave it to him in clipped, exact terms. The rift, the fall, the no-sold quirk, the flame that wasn't flame, the name given freely and nothing else. Endeavor studied Broly for a long moment before he did what none of the tactical units had dared. He walked forward, alone, closing the 30-meter gap without weapon or flame raised, until he stood at the crater's edge looking down. "You've got half this war zone wondering what you are," Endeavor said. His voice carried the particular authority of a man used to being listened to, but there was no threat riding under it, not yet. Just a blunt, evaluating directness. "I'd like an answer before this gets worse for everyone standing here." Broly looked up at him. Something in his expression shifted, subtle but real. Recognition, not of the man specifically, but of the type. Someone who carried himself like the strongest thing in any room he entered. Someone who'd learned to expect that other beings adjusted around him, rather than the reverse. "I'm not looking for a fight," Broly said. His voice was rough with disuse, in a language that wasn't his own, each word deliberate. "I fell into it. That crater says otherwise. That crater is from landing." A flicker of something almost like dry humor crossed his face, gone as fast as it came. "If I wanted a fight, you'd know." Endeavor's eyes narrowed slightly, not offended, calculating. He had faced enough overconfident villains in his career to recognize the difference between bravado and simple fact stated plainly, and something about the flat certainty in Broly's voice landed closer to the second. "You attacked one of my lieutenants," came a new voice, Ashgrave, held at a careful distance by 2 PLF operatives who'd arrived to retrieve him, his wrist bound in an improvised sling, his usual clinical calm cracked at the edges. "Don't stand there playing peaceful." "I stopped when he stopped being a threat," Broly said. and there was an edge now, low and warning. "Don't tell me what I did." The tension on the ridge sharpened instantly, PLF operatives shifting weight, hero units resetting stances, Endeavor's flame giving off the faintest new heat, everyone recalibrating around the fact that this was, potentially, still a live and escalating engagement. Broly rose to his feet in the crater, unhurried, and even that simple motion made every combatant present take an involuntary half-step back, because standing, at his full height, in the ruined bowl of impact he'd made, he looked less like a person and more like a verdict about to be reread. "Stand down," Endeavor said, not to Broly, but to the ridge at large, his voice cutting through the rising static of readiness with the particular command force that had made him number one for a reason. Everyone, now. It was, Kaito would reflect later, one of the more remarkable things he witnessed that day, that Endeavor, arguably the single most combat-hungry hero in the country's arsenal, chose in that moment not to escalate, but to hold the room still, because some old and battle-honed instinct told him that whatever was standing in that crater responded to provocation with a severity none of them were prepared to survive testing. Broly settled, marginally. The golden hum in the air receded a degree. Ashgrave was pulled back toward the PLF's retreating line, his fury banked but not gone, and for a moment, the ridge held in a fragile, watchful quiet. "You're not from here," Endeavor said, once the immediate danger had eased. It wasn't a question. No. Where, then? Broly's jaw worked, some old weight moving behind his eyes. Another world, another version of everything. He looked briefly, involuntarily, up at the sky where the rift had closed. A glance so quick most of the ridge missed it, but Endeavor didn't. "I didn't choose to come here. Can you get back?" "I don't know." The honesty in it was almost startling, coming from something that had just no-sold an S-class caliber quirk without visible effort. "I don't know what tore, or why, or if it opens again." Endeavor was quiet for a moment, weighing something behind his own scarred, calculating expression. Around them, the war ground onto the west, reports crackling in over comms, Shigaraki's forces pressing somewhere beyond the ridgeline, the true scale of the day's crisis a constant undertow beneath this smaller, stranger confrontation. He didn't have the luxury of standing on this ridge indefinitely, and both men seemed to understand it in the same instant. "Here's what happens," Endeavor said. "You come in peacefully, submit to commission assessment, and we figure out what you are and what you want. Fight it, and I promise you every hero this country has will treat you as a hostile the second word gets out. And I don't think you want that, not with whatever's happening out there." He tilted his head faintly westward, toward the grinding sound of the larger war. "You already told him you weren't looking for a fight. Prove it." Broly's eyes moved past Endeavor, taking in the full ring of heroes and commission operatives still holding careful distance, the smoking ruin of the ridge, the retreating PLF line where Ashgrave still glared back at him with wounded fury. Something in his posture, that coiled, held-down spring, eased another fraction. Not trust exactly, but something adjacent to it. A decision that this, for now, was not a fight worth having. "I'll come," he said. "But the first hand that grabs me wrong finds out what I do when I stop holding back." It wasn't a threat delivered for effect. Every person on that ridge understood. In the bone-deep way instinct understands danger before reason catches up, that it was simply a statement of fact, the kind a mountain might make about avalanches. The transport to the nearest secure commission facility took the better part of 2 hours, Broly seated in the back of a reinforced containment vehicle that had been built, originally, to hold villains with mid-tier destructive quirks, and which groaned audibly under his weight, and the faint residual heat still radiating off him even powered down. Kaito rode along at Endeavor's order, ostensibly for continuity of report, though he suspected the real reason was simpler. Someone who'd watched the whole encounter from the start. Someone who could speak to whether Broly's restraint on the ridge had been genuine or performed. Broly said little on the ride. He watched the passing landscape through the vehicle's narrow, reinforced window with an attention that seemed to catalog everything: the shape of the buildings, the strange domesticated ordinariness of a society built entirely around abilities like his own being commonplace, mundane, licensed and regulated, and worn as a badge on people's chests instead of hidden or feared. "Your world," Kaito ventured, partway through the drive, more out of nervous need to fill silence than genuine expectation of an answer. "Is it like this one?" Broly was quiet long enough that Kaito assumed he wouldn't answer at all. "No," he said finally. "Where I'm from, what I can do isn't common." "It's not," he searched for the word, dissatisfied with whatever he found. "Not normal, not safe either. People fear it. People fear me." And here, something almost like bitter amusement moved across his face. Here everyone has something. Doesn't feel so different, being feared. Kaito didn't have an answer for that, and Broly didn't seem to expect one. He went back to watching the window, and the rest of the ride passed in a silence that felt, to Kaito, less like hostility than like grief being carried very carefully, the way a person carries something that will shatter if handled wrong. The facility that received him was one of the Commission's secondary containment and assessment sites, built into a reinforced mountain complex 2 hours south of the war's main theater, designed originally to house captured villains of significant quirk severity pending classification. Broly was led, not shackled, the Commission's on-site director having quietly overruled the standard protocol after reviewing the ridge footage and concluding that any restraint capable of holding him would likely provoke exactly the response everyone most wanted to avoid: into an assessment chamber, built with reinforced walls and observation glass rated, on paper, to withstand quirks up to a specific destructive threshold. Broly looked at the walls once, a brief, assessing glance, and said nothing, though the faint, not quite smile that crossed his face suggested he understood precisely how far those ratings would carry against him if he chose to test them. The assessment itself stretched into the evening. Commission analysts ran him through a battery of questions relayed through a two-way intercom. Origin, capabilities, intentions, the careful diplomatic language of people trying to build a threat profile without triggering the thing they were profiling. Broly answered what he chose to answer, and let long silences stand in place of the rest. He confirmed he'd come through some kind of tier in reality. He confirmed he didn't know if it would reopen. He confirmed, when pressed directly, that he had no interest in conquering, ruling, or destroying anything in this world, a statement the lead analyst noted down with visible, cautious relief. But when asked what he did want, he was quiet for a long time before answering. "To go home," he said, "and if I can't, to be left alone." It was Endeavor, watching from the observation room with the facility director and 2 senior commission officials, who voiced the question underlying the whole assessment: "And if we can't guarantee either?" The intercom carried Broly's answer back flat and unhurried, and something in it made every person in that observation room go very still. "Then you'll learn what happens when I stop being patient. I don't want that. But I've learned not to trust worlds that decide what I am before I've had the chance to show them." Nobody in the room mistook it for a bluff. The director adjourned the assessment for the night, citing the need to consult further up the chain, a decision that would, within 24 hours, land the question of Broly's classification and disposition on a desk considerably higher than her own, in rooms where the Hero Public Safety Commission's senior leadership would begin arguing, with real and mounting urgency, about whether what had fallen into their war was an asset to recruit, a threat to neutralize, or something too large for either category to hold. Outside the facility, night settled over the mountain complex, and somewhere many kilometers west, the Paranormal Liberation War ground on into its own long darkness. Shigaraki's forces regrouping, the League's inner circle recalculating, hero casualties mounting in a fight that had already consumed most of the country's attention, long before a golden-haired stranger fell out of a torn sky. But word travels fast in villain circles too, and by the time the moon was fully up, reports of the Eastern Ridge incident had reached ears far more dangerous than the Commission's assessment chamber, ears belonging to figures within the Paranormal Liberation Front's command structure, who had spent this entire war searching for exactly one thing: leverage, weapons, or allies capable of tipping a fight that was, by any honest accounting, still balanced on a knife's edge. An unclassified being who could no-sell an experienced lieutenant's quirk and shrug off a crater-forming impact was, from where they were sitting, the single most interesting development the war had produced in weeks. By morning, the Commission wouldn't be the only ones trying to find him. The offer came on the second day, delivered not through force but through a gap in the facility's own security that should not have existed. A testament to exactly how deep the Paranormal Liberation Front's reach still ran into infrastructure the war hadn't yet burned away. Broly woke in the assessment chamber to find a folded note slid beneath the reinforced door sometime past midnight, written in a careful, unhurried hand, and when he unfolded it, it held only a short message and a location 2 kilometers from the facility's northern perimeter, past the tree line, at dawn. He considered ignoring it. He considered, for longer, simply walking through the reinforced wall the way he'd have walked through paper, and ending whatever game was being played before it started. But something in him, the same old worn patience that had kept him from finishing Ashgrave on the ridge, decided instead to go and listen, because listening cost nothing, and told him more about this world than another day of careful questions through an intercom ever would. He left the way he'd have preferred not to, through the wall, precisely, though quietly enough that the facility's overnight skeleton crew didn't register the breach until well past sunrise, by which point the story had already outpaced the Commission's ability to contain it. The tree line held a single figure waiting for him, not Ashgrave, but someone new, a gaunt man in a long dark coat, scorched pale at the hem, gray threading through close-cropped hair, standing with the stillness of someone who had learned, over a long and violent career, that stillness read as more dangerous than motion ever could. Renya Kurogane, the man said, by way of introduction, though the name meant nothing to Broly. You'll know the name Ashgrave better. He's a subordinate of mine. You met him on the ridge 2 days ago. I remember him. He remembers you better. A thin, humorless smile. I'm not here to avenge an insult. I'm here because the Paranormal Liberation Front has been fighting a war for longer than you've been aware this world exists, and we've watched Hero Society hoard resources, freedom, and legitimacy for generations, while telling the rest of us we're broken for wanting the same. I imagine from what I've read in the reports leaking out of that facility, you know something about being told what you are by people who never bothered to ask. Broly's jaw tightened. The observation landed closer than he wanted it to. I'm not offering you a cause, Kurogane continued, before Broly could answer. I'm offering you a simple fact. The Commission holding you right now will never let you leave freely. Not really. You're too dangerous to release, and too valuable to lose. Whatever gentle language they use, you are, at best, a very carefully managed captive. We're offering something different: freedom, resources toward finding a way home, and no one pretending they own you. And in exchange, when the moment comes that we need a weapon capable of matching whatever the heroes throw at us, you're there. Kurogane's expression didn't shift, didn't dress the offer up as anything nobler than it was. I won't insult you by pretending otherwise. It was, Broly thought, almost refreshing, the plainness of it, after 2 days of the Commission's careful diplomatic phrasing, designed to make containment sound like partnership. He said nothing for a long moment, weighing it the way he weighed everything, slow and total. You're not the ones who hurt me, he said finally, echoing, almost unconsciously, the words he'd given Ashgrave on the ridge. But you're not offering me anything either. You want a weapon. The Commission wants a specimen. Neither of you have asked what I actually want. And what's that? To be left alone until I find a way home. Nothing more. Kurogane studied him for a long moment, and something in his clinical calm cracked, just slightly, into what might have been respect. That's not an option this war is going to give you. Not from us, not from them. You've already been seen, already been reported, already been discussed in rooms neither of us are in. Whatever you want, the world's going to keep asking you to choose a side. I'd rather you choose ours before someone forces the other. No, Broly said. Simple, final, the same flat certainty that had made every hero on the ridge take an instinctive step back. I choose my own fights, not yours, not theirs. Kurogane's jaw tightened, the closest he came to visible frustration. Then you'll be fighting alone when it matters. I usually am. There was nothing left to negotiate after that, and both of them seemed to understand it in the same breath. Kurogane inclined his head, a gesture that was almost respectful, and stepped back into the tree line's deeper shadow. If you change your mind, or if the Commission's hospitality turns out to be less generous than it looks, the offer doesn't close. We're not the villains their propaganda paints us as. Ask yourself, sometime, why a world this obsessed with power decided a boy with too much of it needed a container instead of a chance. He was gone before Broly could answer, melting into the pre-dawn tree line with the practiced ease of a man who'd survived a war by never being where the retaliation landed. Broly stood alone in the clearing for a long time after, turning the exchange over. There was something uncomfortably familiar in Kurogane's framing, a world deciding what to do with a power it hadn't earned the right to judge. And for the first time since the crater, since the rift, since the searching dread of not knowing whether Chilai and Limo were even alive to miss him, something in his chest twisted toward genuine anger. Not at Kurogane, at the position itself, the reflexive, universal habit every world seemed to share, of looking at what he could do and deciding, immediately, that the only two available responses were to cage it or weaponize it. He walked back toward the facility as the sun cleared the ridge, and by the time he reached the perimeter, the breach had been discovered, and the Commission's response was already in motion. Not hostile, not yet, but tighter, faster, edged with the particular anxiety of an organization that had just realized its containment measures meant nothing against something that could leave and return at will. Endeavor met him at the gate, flame-banked low but present, flanked by a security detail that had at least tripled since the previous night. You left. I came back. That's not the same as staying. Endeavor's eyes narrowed, reading something in Broly's expression he clearly didn't like. Who approached you? Broly considered lying, considered saying nothing at all, and found, in the end, that he had no particular reason to protect Kurogane's overture. The Liberation Front, a lieutenant, offered me freedom in exchange for fighting on their side, eventually, whenever they decide they need me. The security detail's posture sharpened visibly. Endeavor's flame guttered brighter for a half-second before he reined it back in. And you told him? No. Flat final. I told him the same thing I'm telling you. I'm not fighting anyone's war. Not yours. Not theirs. That's not really a choice you get. Not anymore. Endeavor's voice carried genuine frustration now, the strain of a man managing a war on one front suddenly forced to manage an entirely separate crisis on another. The moment you fell out of that sky, you stopped being someone who gets to stand outside this. Both sides know what you can do. Both sides are going to keep pulling at you until you pick a direction, whether you want to or not. Then I'll break both their hands. It wasn't bravado. It landed with the same terrible, simple certainty as everything else Broly said. And Endeavor, who had spent a career learning to read exactly how much weight sat behind a threat, didn't mistake it for one either. The two of them stood in the gate's morning light, a superhero who had clawed his way to the top of an entire nation's power structure through will and fire, and a being from beyond that nation's reality who had never asked to be anyone's top of anything. And for a moment neither spoke, each recalculating the other in the silence. Come inside, Endeavor said finally, some of the edge gone out of his voice, replaced by something more tired, more honest. Not as a prisoner. I'll make that argument myself, if it comes to it. But if the front already knows what you are, staying out here alone isn't freedom, it's just an easier target. At least inside you've got people willing to fight for the idea that you shouldn't have to fight for anyone. It wasn't trust, not yet, not really. But it was the first offer either side had made him that didn't have a hook buried inside it. And something in Broly, worn down by 2 days of careful questioning and one clarifying, unwelcome conversation in a dark tree line, recognized the difference. He walked through the gate. What neither of them knew yet, what wouldn't surface in commission channels or PLF chatter for another full day, was that Kurogane's overture in the tree line had not been a rogue initiative. It had been sanctioned, quietly, by voices higher in the front's fractured command structure than even he answered to directly, voices that had spent the war's long months growing increasingly convinced that raw, overwhelming individual power was the one currency the heroes had never learned to counter. And somewhere in the depths of that structure, a report was already being compiled. Broly's height, his no-sold quirk resistance, the golden transformation witnessed on the ridge, his rejection of Kurogane's offer duly noted, filed, and set aside rather than discarded. Because an organization built on the philosophy that power should answer to no one but itself did not, as a rule, take rejection as a final answer. They would try again, not soon, not carelessly, but they would try again, and next time the offer would come with less patience behind it, and considerably more leverage. For now, though, Broly walked into a commission facility under his own power, having chosen for the second time in as many days to stand apart from both sides pulling at him. And somewhere in that choice, unnoticed even by himself, the shape of the story ahead had already begun to change from a question of containment into a question of what kind of ally, or what kind of enemy, hero society had actually welcomed through its gate. The war outside kept burning, and 2 kilometers south, unseen by anyone yet watching Broly, the sky over the Gunga Ridge held one last, thin scar of green-gold light, faint, easy to miss, and not quite as fully closed as everyone had assumed. 3 days passed inside the mountain facility with a strange, brittle calm, Broly submitting, with visible reluctance, to further rounds of assessment. The Commission's senior leadership locked in escalating internal argument about his classification, Endeavor splitting his attention between the grinding stalemate of the Paranormal Liberation War's main theater and the increasingly urgent question of what to do with a being none of their protocols had ever been built to hold. It was a calm that everyone involved understood, on some level, as borrowed time. It ran out on the 4th morning. The attack came just before dawn, and it did not come subtle. A PLF strike force, larger and better coordinated than anything the Eastern Theater had seen since the war's opening weeks, hit the mountain facility's perimeter with a synchronized assault clearly designed for exactly one purpose: not to destroy the facility, but to reach whatever was being held inside it. Kaito was on perimeter duty when the first alarm sounded, and the sight that greeted him at the tree line stopped his breath in his chest. Dozens of PLF operatives, quirks flaring in overlapping waves. Fire, force, corrosive gas, a bristling wall of coordinated violence rolling toward the facility's outer wall with the discipline of a unit that had rehearsed this. At the center of the formation, unmistakable even at a distance, walked Renya Kurogane, his scorched coat flaring behind him, Ashgrave at his shoulder with his wrist fully healed, and his expression set in cold, focused purpose. "They're not here for the facility," Kaito said into his calm, voice tight. "They're here for him." The Commission's response mobilized fast, every hero on site converging toward the perimeter, ice walls rising, flame lines forming, a hasty defensive architecture thrown up against a force that outnumbered the facility's garrison nearly 3-to-1. Endeavor was among them within minutes, his own flame roaring to full output, cutting a swath of scorched earth through the first wave of PLF operatives with the brutal, practiced efficiency that had made him number one. It held, for a while. It held the way a dam holds, groaning, before the pressure finds the crack. The crack came when Kurogane himself stepped forward, past his own front line, and called out, not to the heroes defending the wall, but past them, toward the facility's inner chamber, his voice carrying with the flat clarity of a man who had planned exactly this moment. Broly, this isn't for you. It's because of you. They'll bleed 100 of my people into this wall before they let you walk free on your own terms. Come out, and every hero here lives through this morning. Stay in there, and you're just as much their prisoner as you'd be ours. Except at least we're honest about the cage. Inside the assessment chamber, Broly heard it through the reinforced walls, and something in him went very still. The particular stillness that Kaito, watching from the perimeter, had already learned to recognize as the moment before the storm actually broke. He didn't wait for permission. He didn't wait for an escort, or a commission liaison, or any of the careful diplomatic scaffolding that had structured every interaction of the past 4 days. He simply walked through the chamber's reinforced wall a second time, cleaner this time, more deliberate, a fist-sized hole widening under controlled pressure until the whole section gave way in a shower of pulverized concrete, and stepped out into the gray light of a battle that had, in every sense that mattered, been staged entirely around him. The effect on the battlefield was immediate. PLF operatives who'd been trading blows with hero units froze mid-motion at the sight of him crossing the open ground toward the perimeter wall, his expression unreadable, his gait unhurried in a way that read, to everyone watching, as far more dangerous than a run would have. I told you already, Broly said, stopping just inside the wall, close enough now that both Kurogane and Endeavor could hear him without the comm relay. His voice was low, and beneath it, the air had already begun to hum with that unmistakable rising pressure. I don't fight anyone's war. You don't have a choice anymore, Kurogane said. Look around you. This is what happens when the world decides you're a resource instead of a person. Everyone with a claim starts pulling. I told you I'd rather you choose. I meant it. But I won't let the commission keep what should be free. And you think dragging 100 people into a fight I never wanted proves your point? Kurogane's jaw set. I think it proves theirs won't stop either. At least know which cage you're fighting your way out of. It was Ashgrave who moved first, unable, or unwilling, to hold his restraint a second longer. Ash boiling off both palms in a wave meant to blanket the entire gap between them. Broly didn't so much dodge it as simply refuse it, a golden light kindling around him fast enough that the ash caught fire and scattered to nothing 3 feet from his skin, the same instinctive rejection the villain had felt on the ridge 4 days earlier, except now backed by 4 days of banked, restless frustration finally given somewhere to go. Enough, Broly said, and this time the word carried weight that flattened the air around it. His hair had already begun lifting, gold bleeding through black, the ground beneath his feet cracking under pressure that hadn't even fully arrived yet. You want to fight, fine, but not with them. He tilted his head, the barest fraction, toward the hero line at his back. With me. Only me. Call your people off the wall, and I'll give you everything you came for. It was, Kaito realized, watching from a defensive line that had gone very quiet, an offer of exactly the kind of overwhelming singular confrontation the PLF strike force could never have hoped to survive, and Broly was making it anyway, deliberately, to spare a facility full of heroes and commissioned staff a battle that was never truly theirs to fight. Kurogane studied him for a long moment, weighing the offer against every tactical instinct honed across a long war, and found, in the end, that he believed it. He raised a hand, and the PLF line, trained, disciplined, answering that single gesture with immediate obedience, began falling back from the perimeter wall, disengaging from a fight they had, until 30 seconds ago, been fully committed to. Stand down, Endeavor barked to his own line, understanding the shape of what was happening a half-second behind Kurogane, but no less decisively, because whatever else was true, a full-output confrontation contained to two combatants was infinitely preferable to the alternative currently unfolding across his perimeter wall. The two forces separated, PLF operatives retreating into the tree line, hero units holding the wall but lowering weapons, until the open ground between the facility and the ridge belonged to exactly two figures. Broly, hair now fully golden, the air around him shimmering with contained heat, and Kurogane, standing his ground with a calm that Kaito recognized, uneasily, as either genuine confidence or a very well-practiced mask over its absence. "You understand," Kurogane said, "that I don't actually expect to win this. Then why fight it? Because sometimes the point isn't winning." Ash began gathering around his hands, denser and more controlled than anything Kaito had seen him deploy before. Not a wave this time, but something being built, layered, shaped with obvious deliberate intent. Sometimes the point is making sure the people watching remember that we didn't just roll over, that the Liberation Front looked at the strongest thing this war has produced and didn't flinch. He struck first, and struck hard, a technique clearly reserved for exactly this kind of desperate symbolic confrontation. A compressed lance of hardened ash, launched with enough force to punch through reinforced concrete, aimed not at Broly's body, but at the ground beneath him, an attempt to collapse the earth itself and bury him before he could fully power up. The ground shattered. Broly didn't fall with it. He simply stood, weightless in the way that only overwhelming power could fake, on air that had no right to hold him, and looked down at the crater Kurogane's attack had opened with the same flat, unbothered patience he'd shown Ashgrave 4 days earlier. "That's not going to work," he said, and descended, slow and deliberate, until his feet found solid ground again on the crater's far lip. Kurogane didn't stop. He layered attack after attack. Ash spears, calcifying waves, a final desperate technique that converted the very air around Broly into a dense, gritty fog meant to choke and blind, and every single one broke against a will that had, by this point, stopped even bothering to actively defend, absorbing the assault the way a mountain absorbs weather. Broly let him exhaust himself across nearly 2 full minutes of escalating, increasingly frantic technique, and Kaito understood, watching, that this too was a kind of mercy, that Broly could have ended it in the first 3 seconds and chose, instead, to let Kurogane fight until the fight itself proved his point better than any words could have. When Kurogane finally staggered, breath ragged, Ash reserves visibly, physically spent, Broly closed the last of the distance between them at a speed that shouldn't have been possible for something his size, and caught the older man's collapsing form before he hit the ground. Not a killing blow, not even a restraining grip, just a hand steadying a body that had nothing left to give. "You made your point," Broly said, low enough that only Kurogane, gasping, could hear it clearly. "Nobody watching thinks you flinched." He set him down, gently, on the cracked earth, and straightened to face the tree line where the remaining PLF operatives stood frozen, weapons half raised, uncertain whether they'd just watch their lieutenant lose or watch something closer to a spared execution. "Take him," Broly said, and there was no threat left in it now, just tired, final weight. "This is done. Tell whoever sent you that I'm not a weapon either side gets to point. Not the commission's. Not yours." The PLF line hesitated only a moment before 2 operatives broke from the tree line to retrieve Kurogane, hauling him back toward whatever extraction route the strike force had planned, before this entire operation had collapsed into a single, symbolic, unwinnable duel. Ashgrave lingered longest, staring at Broly with an expression that had shifted, in the span of one battle, from hatred into something more complicated. Not respect exactly, but the particular unwilling acknowledgement that comes from watching someone choose restraint they clearly didn't need to choose. Then they were gone, melting back into the ridgeline the way they'd come, leaving the facility's perimeter smoking and cratered, but, remarkably, without a single hero casualty. Endeavor found him standing alone in the center of the battlefield he'd just ended single-handedly, gold fading back to black, shoulders dropping under a weariness that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. "You could have leveled that entire strike force in under a minute," Endeavor said. "It wasn't quite a question." "I know. You didn't. I told you already." Broly's voice was rough, quieter now than it had been at any point since the Ridge. "I'm tired of being something people decide the terms of. Killing 100 of his people wouldn't have proven anything except that I'm exactly the weapon everyone keeps trying to make me into." Endeavor studied him for a long moment, something shifting behind his own scarred, calculating features. Not quite trust, but the beginning of something that might, eventually, grow into it. "The Commission's going to want a full account of this, and there'll be people up the chain arguing this proves you're too dangerous to leave unsupervised, no matter how it looked from where I was standing. Let them argue." Broly turned, finally, to look at the facility behind them, cratered, scorched, but standing, its garrison intact. A fight that could have cost dozens of lives, instead costing none. "I didn't do that for the Commission. I did it because it was the only way to end this without becoming exactly what both sides already think I am." He walked back through the shattered gate under his own power, again, for the second time in 4 days. Not a captive, not quite an ally, but something the facility's staff, watching him pass, had started, almost without noticing, to regard less like a contained anomaly, and more like the single most important variable this war had produced. Far above them, unnoticed by anyone still recovering from the morning's battle, that thin scar of green-gold light over the Gunga Ridge had grown, in the past 4 days, from a barely visible seam into something wider, patient, silent, and very much still open. Word of the battle at the mountain facility reached the Commission's senior leadership within the hour, and reached the war's central command structure not long after, filtered up through channels that had spent the past 4 days treating Broly as a containment problem, and now, abruptly, had to reckon with the fact that he had just ended a coordinated PLF assault without a single hero casualty, at cost only to himself and the men who'd come to take him. The argument that followed, conducted across secure channels and closed-door sessions, Broly was not invited to but heard about anyway through Kaito, who'd taken to visiting the assessment chamber less as a guard now, and more as something closer to the closest thing Broly had to a familiar face in this world, split the Commission's leadership cleanly in two. One faction, citing the Ridge, the Ash Strike, the sheer unclassified scale of his power, pushed for permanent, secure containment, polite language wrapped around a cage, whatever Endeavor might argue to the contrary. The other, led in no small part by Endeavor himself, pushed for something closer to provisional trust, monitored freedom, in exchange for continued cooperation, built on the plain evidence that Broly had, twice now, chosen restraint when overwhelming force would have cost him nothing. The argument was still unresolved on the 6th day, when the sky over the Gunga Ridge tore open again. It happened at dusk, without warning, the same green-gold scar widening in the space of a few violent seconds into a full rift, humming with the same terrible pressure that had first announced Broly's arrival. Except this time, something came through that wasn't falling. Something came through searching, a smaller shape silhouetted against the tear's unstable light, dropping through with far more control than Broly's own impact had shown, landing lightly on the scorched ground of the same crater that still scarred the ridge from 6 days before. Kaito, part of the perimeter team still stationed at the site monitoring residual energy readings, watched it happen in real time and put the call through before the figure had even fully straightened from the landing. Broly, back at the mountain facility 2 hours south, felt it before the call reached him. That same old, unmistakable pressure in the air, distant now but unmistakably real, a frequency his body had learned to recognize across more worlds than this one. He was out through the wall, A clean, practiced hole this time, the facility staff having stopped flinching at the sound days ago, before Endeavor could finish relaying the coordinates. The flight to the ridge took him 20 minutes at a speed that left scorch marks in the clouds behind him, and when he landed at the crater's edge, gold hair still fading from the transformation he'd triggered mid-flight without fully meaning to, he found a small figure standing exactly where he'd once knelt. Lean, green-skinned, dressed in a battered flight suit. A scouter cracked but functional over one eye. Expression caught somewhere between relief and disbelief. "Lemo," Broly said, and something in his voice broke open in a way it hadn't once in 6 days of careful, weighted restraint. "You look." Lemo's voice cracked, and he closed the distance at a dead run, grabbing Broly's forearm like he needed the physical confirmation that this wasn't some trick, some illusion conjured by 6 days of increasingly desperate searching. "You're alive." "You're actually." Chilai's going to lose her mind. She's holding the ship steady on the other side. "We didn't know if the rift would even open twice. We didn't know if you were even—" "I'm here," Broly said, quiet, and for the first time since the fall, since the crater, since 6 days of measured caution in a world that had spent every one of those days trying to decide what to do with him. Something in his chest unclenched fully. The commission response team arrived within minutes, Endeavor at the lead, flanked by a full tactical unit, weapons and quirks primed at the sight of a second unregistered arrival, and found not a new crisis but something closer to a reunion. Broly standing with a hand braced protectively near a much smaller figure who was very clearly no threat to anyone, both of them caught in the particular relief of people who genuinely believed they might never see each other again. "This is Lemo," Broly said, before anyone could raise a weapon or a question. "He's not a threat. He's—" The word he reached for landed with an unfamiliar, careful weight. "Family. As much as I have." Endeavor lowered his own stance, marginally, reading the scene with the same fast, total assessment that had shaped every decision he'd made since the ridge 6 days earlier. "The rift," he said instead, cutting to what mattered most. "It's still open?" "Unstable," Lemo said, activating the scouter with a practiced tap, feeding readouts across its cracked display. "Chilai's got maybe another hour before the containment field she's running degrades past the point we can hold it stable. If Broly's coming back, it has to be now." The words landed on the ridge with a weight that pulled every conversation of the past 6 days into sudden, sharp focus. Broly turned to look at Endeavor, and at Kaito, standing a little further back among the response team, and at the facility beyond the ridge where a commission still divided on his classification had spent a week trying to decide whether he was a weapon, a prisoner, or something they'd never built a category for. "You could stay," Endeavor said. It wasn't quite an order and wasn't quite a plea, something more honest than either, the closest thing to an admission the #1 hero had offered anyone in longer than he could easily remember. "The commission's still arguing, but I'd fight for it. Provisional freedom. A place here, if you wanted one. You proved something on that battlefield 4 days ago that not many beings, quirked or otherwise, ever get the chance to prove." Broly was quiet for a long moment, weighing it the way he weighed everything. The strange, domesticated ordinariness of a world where what he could do was common instead of feared for its rarity. The plain, uncomplicated relief of standing across from someone who'd search a broken rift on the barest chance of finding him. The 6 days of careful restraint that had cost him more, in their own way, than any battle. "I appreciate it," he said finally, and meant it, in a voice that carried none of the flat certainty he'd used on Kurogane, none of the coiled warning he'd given every stranger who'd tried to claim him in the past week. Just something plain and tired and honest. "But this isn't my world. It's not my fight. I spent every day here waiting to be told what I was going to be used for, even by the people trying to be kind about it. I don't want that. I want to go home, to the 2 people who spent 6 days tearing a hole in reality on the chance I was still alive on the other side of it." Endeavor studied him for a long moment, and something in his scarred, weathered expression settled into something that wasn't quite disappointment, closer, if anything, to respect. "Can't say I blame you, for what it's worth," Broly added, and there was the faintest trace of that same dry, buried humor he'd shown once before, on the crater's edge. 6 days ago, your world's not as bad as it could have been. People here at least ask before they decide what you are. Where I've been, that's rarer than you'd think. Kaito stepped forward, unable to help himself, something in the moment pulling the words out before he'd fully decided to say them. "Will you remember any of this? Where you're going?" Broly looked at him, the first person on this ridge who genuinely tried to see him as something other than a threat profile or a resource to be claimed. 6 days ago, in the chaotic minutes after the fall, and something in his answer carried real weight. "I'll remember there was a world that watched something it didn't understand fall out of the sky, and instead of just deciding I was a monster, gave me the chance to prove I wasn't one." He paused. "That's not nothing." The rift overhead had begun to widen further, its edges brightening, the pressure in the air building toward whatever threshold Limo's scouter was tracking with increasing urgency on its cracked display. "We need to go," Limo said. "Now, or not at all." Broly nodded once, and turned to face the assembled heroes and commission operatives one last time. The same ridge, the same crater, the same gathered witnesses who'd first met him as an unclassified anomaly, and were, 6 days later, watching him leave as something closer to an ally they'd never fully earned the chance to keep. "Tell whoever's still arguing about my classification," he said, a final dry edge in his voice, "that they can close the file. I'm not their problem to solve anymore." He walked toward the rift's shifting light, Limo at his side already relaying coordinates back through the scouter to whoever waited, straining, on the other end of the tier, and at the threshold. For just a moment he paused and looked back, not at Endeavor, not at the assembled tactical units, but at the ridge itself, the crater that had marked his arrival, the scorched ground where a war he'd never asked to enter had, for 6 strange days, made room for him to choose who he wanted to be, instead of simply what he could do. Then he stepped through, and the rift, its purpose finally spent, folded closed behind him in a final pulse of green-gold light. And this time, everyone on the ridge understood, without needing Limo's readouts to confirm it, that it would not open again. The silence that followed stretched long across the ridge, the kind of silence that settles after something enormous has passed through a place and left it fundamentally, permanently marked. Endeavor stood at the crater's edge for a long moment, staring up at a sky that had gone, finally, unremarkably empty, before turning back toward the facility and the war that had never fully stopped grinding on beyond this smaller, stranger story. The Commission's file on the incident closed within the week, quietly, without fanfare, filed under a classification that would never see wide release, though the Eastern Ridge itself would be marked, unofficially, by every hero who'd stood on it that first chaotic day, as the place something impossible had briefly, carefully, chosen not to become what everyone expected of it. Kaito visited the crater once more before it was finally cleared and repurposed, weeks later, after the war itself had ground toward its own uncertain resolution. Shigaraki's fate settled far to the west, All for One's long shadow finally, brutally addressed, hero society left standing but scarred in ways it would spend years processing. He stood at the crater's edge in the quiet aftermath and found himself thinking, not for the first time, about the particular weight in Broly's voice when he'd said that's not nothing, about a being who'd spent an entire life being defined by fear before this one, brief, chaotic collision with a world willing, if only barely, to ask first. Endeavor never spoke publicly about the incident, though those closest to him noted a subtle, lasting shift in how the number one hero approached the next unclassified threat that crossed his path. A little more patience before the flame, a little more willingness to ask the question before assuming the answer. Somewhere beyond the reach of any world's commission or front, In a universe of its own, a golden-haired figure sat beside a battered ship's viewport, a green-skinned friend at his shoulder, and a fierce, relieved companion piloting them home, carrying with him the memory of 6 strange days where a world that had every reason to fear him chose, instead, to wonder. And in the space that wondering opened, however briefly, something in him that had spent a lifetime bracing for the worst had finally, for once, been allowed to hope for something better. The ridge healed, as ridges do. The story didn't. It became, in time, exactly the kind of thing Hero Society would tell in careful, half-believing whispers for years to come. The day the sky tore open, and the strongest thing that had ever fallen through it chose, in the end, simply to go home.